They said this land wasn't hers to keep. They were wrong. Stay to the end. Subscribe and like to support stories that matter. Hannah Wilson buried her husband on a cold morning in late April of 1976. The service was held in a small wooden church outside Livingston, Montana, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and silence carried more weight than words. The wind moved through the valley without obstruction, sweeping across the open land and rattling the windows, as if the world itself refused to stand still for grief. Ranchers from neighboring properties filled the pews, their hats held low in their hands, faces weathered by years of sun and work. They came out of respect for James Wilson, a man who had spent his life on the land and earned quiet admiration without ever asking for it. Hannah sat in the front row alone. She wore a black coat that felt too thin against the spring cold, though she barely noticed. The seat beside her remained empty, and no one dared to sit there. James should have been there, leaning slightly forward, hands clasped, listening with polite patience. Instead, his absence filled the space more completely than his presence ever had. Hannah kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, refusing to let the tears fall in front of the town. Grief, she believed, was private. The last thing she wanted was pity. James had died instantly in a highway accident on Interstate 90, a collision that made no sense to Hannah, no matter how many times she replayed it in her mind. One moment he was driving back from Billings with supplies, the next he was gone. There had been no goodbye, no final conversation, no chance to prepare, only a knock at the door and a state trooper standing in the yard, hat in hand, eyes already apologetic. After the service, people spoke in low voices, offering condolences, saying the same careful phrases Hannah had heard all week. If you need anything, he was a good man. We're so sorry. She nodded, thanked them, absorbed their words without truly hearing them. By early afternoon, the crowd thinned. Trucks pulled away down the long gravel road, one by one, until only Hannah's pickup remained in the church lot. She drove back to the ranch alone. The road stretched ahead of her, familiar in every curve and rise, yet suddenly foreign. The Wilson Ranch had always been a shared responsibility, something she and James carried together, even when he did most of the physical work. Hannah managed the books, tracked expenses, handled contracts, and knew exactly when cattle prices shifted or feed costs rose. But James had been the constant presence in the fields, the one who walked the fences, worked the herd, and made the land feel alive. Without him, the ranch felt unnervingly quiet. The house greeted her with stillness. James's boots sat by the door, where he had left them days earlier. His jacket hung on the back of a chair. Hannah stood in the entryway for a long moment, keys still in her hand, unsure where to go or what to do, now that there was nothing left to organize, and no one left to take care of but herself. Outside, the land waited. 560 acres spread out beneath a wide Montana sky, rolling pasture land, weathered fencing, grazing cattle moving slowly with the ease of routine. Nearly 470 head depended on the ranch to survive. Spring calving season was underway, contracts were signed months in advance, and summer grazing plans were already set in motion. The work did not pause for grief. That night, Hannah sat alone at the kitchen table, paperwork spread in front of her. Bills, feed invoices, veterinary schedules, loan statements. She had gone through these documents hundreds of times before, but now every number felt heavier. There was no one to double-check decisions with, no familiar voice to confirm or challenge her thinking. The responsibility was absolute, and it was hers. She poured herself a cup of coffee long after sunset, even though she knew sleep would be difficult. Her body felt hollow, drained of energy but too tense to rest. When she finally went to bed, James's side remained untouched. She lay awake, listening to the wind, wondering how many nights like this lay ahead. The next morning came early, as it always did on the ranch. Hannah woke before dawn out of habit, her body still aligned with the life she and James had built together. She dressed quietly, brewed coffee, and stepped outside just as the horizon began to lighten. The air was cold and clean. The cattle stirred in the distance. For a brief moment, everything felt exactly as it always had. Then reality settled back in. She walked the property slowly, taking in details she had rarely examined on her own. Fence posts leaning slightly, a gate hinge that needed tightening, water troughs that would need attention before summer heat arrived. These were manageable problems, she told herself. Practical problems. The kind that could be solved with work. Still, beneath the steady rhythm of tasks, doubt crept in. Hannah had never questioned her place on the ranch before. Now, with James gone, she felt the weight of unspoken judgment pressing in from all sides. She knew how people talked. A woman alone, a ranch this size. It won't last. She had heard variations of it whispered over the years, when other widows sold their land or moved into town. It wasn't cruelty, she told herself. It was expectation. That afternoon, as she stood near the corral watching the cattle move, the question she had avoided finally demanded an answer. Could she really do this alone? Not just for weeks or months, but for years. Could she maintain the land, the herd, the business, and herself without breaking under the strain? The thought of selling crossed her mind briefly, uninvited and unwelcome. There would be money, security, a house in town with less work and fewer demands, but the idea left her cold. The ranch was not an asset to her. It was a life. It was mornings like this and evenings under an open sky. It was the place where she and James had spent decades building something tangible, something earned. As the sun rose higher, Hannah made her decision, though she did not say it aloud. She would stay. She would keep the ranch running. She would not make any irreversible choices in the first days of grief. Whatever came next, she would face it from here, on her land. That night, she returned to the house tired, but resolute. She wrote out a list of tasks for the coming weeks and pinned it above the kitchen sink. There was comfort in the structure, in knowing what needed to be done, even if the future remained uncertain. When she finally turned off the lights, the house felt no less empty, but Hannah felt something else beneath the sadness. Determination. Outside, the wind moved steadily across the fields, and the ranch settled into darkness, waiting for the work ahead. The first visit came less than 2 weeks after the funeral. Hannah was repairing a section of fence along the western pasture when she saw 2 unfamiliar vehicles turning off the county road and heading toward the house. Dust followed them in slow clouds, drifting across the yard. She straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans, and watched as they parked near the porch. Roy Wilson stepped out first. James's older brother looked uncomfortable in the open space, his city shoes already coated in dirt. Behind him came Michael, a cousin Hannah had seen only a handful of times over the years. A third man followed, well-dressed, carrying a leather folder. Hannah recognized him immediately for what he was before he spoke. They greeted her politely, their voices carrying a rehearsed calm. Roy offered condolences again, this time with a tone that suggested obligation rather than grief. The man with the folder introduced himself as a real estate agent from Billings, explaining that he specialized in agricultural properties. Hannah listened without interrupting, her expression neutral, though her stomach tightened with every word. They sat at the kitchen table where Hannah had gone over accounts with James for years. The familiarity of the space only sharpened the intrusion. The agent opened his folder and spread documents across the table, outlining market conditions, land values, and recent sales in the area. He spoke of opportunity and timing, of interest from a large meat operation looking to expand into Montana. Roy leaned forward, folding his hands. He spoke carefully, as if each word had been weighed in advance. He told Hannah that he was concerned for her, that running a ranch of this size alone would be overwhelming. He said James had worked himself hard for years, and even he had struggled. Michael nodded along, adding that the offer on the table was generous, more than fair given the circumstances. Hannah listened, letting them finish. When she spoke, her voice was steady. She thanked them for their concern and told them she had no intention of selling. The ranch was her home. It was where she belonged. The air in the room shifted. The agent closed his folder slowly. Roy frowned, clearly surprised that the conversation had not gone as planned. He tried again, this time emphasizing practicality. He spoke of safety, of financial security, of how much easier life could be in town. He reminded her that the land market was unpredictable and that now was the best time to step away. Hannah shook her head. She told them she understood the risks, that she had been part of the ranch operation for decades. She said she was capable of making her own decisions. Michael's tone hardened. He said it wasn't about capability, it was about reality. He pointed out that people were already talking, that neighbors were watching to see how long she would last. He suggested that refusing the offer was emotional, not rational. That was when Hannah stood up. She gathered the papers and slid them back across the table. She told them the conversation was over. Roy looked frustrated, muttered something about pride, and stood as well. The agent offered his card before leaving it on the table, just in case she changed her mind. After they left, Hannah remained standing in the kitchen, her hands clenched. She felt anger rising beneath the surface, mixed with something sharper. Doubt. Not because she believed them, but because she knew others would. The days that followed were harder than she expected. Without James, every task took longer. Small problems stacked up quickly. A water pump failed in one pasture. A section of fencing collapsed after a night of heavy wind. Hannah worked until her muscles ached and her hands blistered, learning through trial and error what James had done instinctively. In town, conversations shifted when she entered a room. Some neighbors offered help, genuine and kind. Others watched from a distance, their curiosity barely disguised. She heard snippets of conversation when she wasn't meant to. People wondered aloud how long she could keep going. They spoke as if the outcome were inevitable. The pressure wore on her. At night, Hannah lay awake replaying Roy's words, hearing the logic behind them even as she rejected the conclusion. She knew the numbers. She knew the margins were thin. One bad season could undo everything. Summer arrived early that year, bringing heat and dry winds. Rain was scarce, and the pastures began to brown sooner than expected. Hannah adjusted grazing rotations, stretched feed reserves, and monitored the herd closely. Every decision felt heavier, every mistake more costly. In July, a calf fell ill. Then another. Hannah called the veterinarian immediately, but the loss still cut deep. Each death felt like a personal failure, evidence that she might be proving her critics right. When Roy and Michael returned later that month, their timing felt deliberate. They didn't bring the agent this time. They didn't need to. They walked the land with her, pointing out dry patches and thin fencing, asking pointed questions about costs and long-term sustainability. They framed their concern as responsibility, as doing what was best for the family legacy. Hannah pushed back, defending her decisions, explaining her plans. But she could feel the ground shifting beneath her. Their tone was no longer persuasive. It was preparatory. When the official letter arrived in October, Hannah wasn't surprised. The envelope bore a legal seal. Inside, the language was formal and cold. Roy and Michael were petitioning for a review of the ranch's management, claiming that the property was being mishandled and that its value was at risk. They were seeking a forced sale. Hannah sat at the table long after she finished reading. Outside, the cattle moved slowly across the pasture, unaware of the threat hanging over the land. The ranch felt suddenly fragile, as if it could be taken from her, not by force, but by paperwork and perception. That night, she made a call. She knew the fight ahead would not be won with stubbornness alone. If she was going to keep the ranch, she would have to prove she deserved it in ways no one had ever demanded of her before. The legal notice changed everything. Until that moment, Hannah had believed that determination and hard work would be enough, that if she simply kept the ranch running, the doubts would eventually fade. Now she understood that this was no longer about opinion or gossip. It was about proof, about records, appearances, and standards set by people who had never lifted a fence post or walked a pasture at dawn. She contacted Edward Klein the morning after the letter arrived. He operated out of a small office in Bozeman and had a reputation for being blunt. When Hannah explained the situation, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. "They're not saying you can't work," he said finally. "They're saying you're not working well enough. That's a harder thing to fight." They met later that week. Edward reviewed the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. He explained that the argument against her would hinge on interpretation. If Roy and Michael could convince a judge that the ranch was being mismanaged or that its value was declining under her control, the court could intervene. Hannah asked what she needed to do. "You document everything," Edward said. "You treat this ranch like a business under a microscope, because that's exactly what it is now." From that point forward, Hannah worked as if every action might one day be questioned. She kept detailed logs of feed purchases, veterinary visits, grazing rotations, and maintenance schedules. She photographed repairs before and after. She saved receipts and contracts, organized them by date and category, and built a paper trail where there had once only been routine. The physical work did not slow. If anything, it intensified. She rose before sunrise and often worked until the light faded completely. She fixed fences, checked water sources, moved cattle, and managed feed distribution with relentless focus. Her body protested constantly. Her hands hardened and cracked. Her back ached in ways she had never known before. Summer turned to fall, and the weather grew unpredictable. Cold snaps arrived early, followed by sudden warm spells that confused the herd and complicated grazing plans. Hannah adjusted constantly, relying on instinct sharpened by years of observation rather than experience alone. She made mistakes, corrected them, and learned faster than she thought possible. The community took notice. Neighbors who had watched quietly began to offer support. One rancher stopped by with spare fencing materials. Another shared advice on pasture recovery after drought. They didn't say much, but their presence mattered. It reminded Hannah that she was not as alone as Roy wanted her to believe. Still, the pressure never lifted. She knew Roy and Michael were watching from a distance, gathering their own information, framing every challenge as evidence against her. When a section of fencing failed during a storm, she repaired it the same day. When a water line froze unexpectedly, she worked through the night to restore it. There was no room for delay, no allowance for exhaustion. Edward checked in regularly, reviewing her records and offering guidance. He encouraged her to gather independent verification of the ranch's condition. Hannah hired a veterinarian to provide a written assessment of herd health. She contacted a land specialist to evaluate pasture conditions and sustainability. Each report added weight to her case, but also to her burden. By early spring, preparations for planting and calving overlapped. The workload was punishing. Hannah's weight dropped noticeably, and her sleep became fragmented. She ignored the signs, focused entirely on the work in front of her. To slow down now would be to confirm every accusation leveled against her. As the court date approached, Edward warned her not to underestimate the opposition. "They're going to make this personal," he said. "They'll talk about your age, your health, your future. They'll question whether you can keep this up." Hannah nodded. She already knew. The questions had been echoing in her own mind for months. In the final weeks before the hearing, she gathered statements from neighbors willing to speak on her behalf. People who had seen the ranch before and after James's death. People who could testify that the land was not deteriorating, that the operation was stable. She compiled financial summaries, showing that despite a difficult year, the ranch remained viable. On the morning the paperwork was filed with the court, Hannah stood in the yard and looked out across the fields. The land showed the marks of constant care. Fences stood straight. Pastures were managed. The herd moved calmly, healthy and alert. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She felt fear, sharper than before, but also something else. Resolve. Whatever happened next would not erase the work she had done or the truth she carried. She had not failed, and she was ready to stand before anyone who claimed otherwise. The night before the hearing, Hannah sat at the kitchen table reviewing her documents one last time. Outside, the wind moved across the ranch as it always had, indifferent to human conflict. She gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, she would have to defend not just the ranch, but her right to remain on it. The courthouse in Gallatin County was smaller than Hannah expected. The building sat just off the main street, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of use. On the morning of the hearing, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of sky that pressed down on everything beneath it. Hannah arrived early, documents boxed neatly under her arm, her jaw tight with concentration. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Roy and Michael were already seated on one side, their attorney beside them, speaking in hushed tones. They avoided Hannah's eyes. Edward Klein met her at the front row, nodded once, and motioned for her to sit. He looked calm, almost detached, which Hannah took as a good sign. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Proceedings began without ceremony. Roy's attorney spoke first, laying out the case in measured, professional language. He argued that Hannah's refusal to sell the ranch, despite an attractive offer, demonstrated emotional decision-making rather than sound management. He spoke about her age, the physical demands of ranching, and the strain of operating such a large property alone. He suggested that the ranch's long-term value was at risk. Hannah listened, hands folded tightly in her lap. Each sentence felt like a test she had already been preparing for months. When the attorney finished, Edward rose slowly and approached the bench. He began with the facts. He presented financial records, showing that the ranch remained operational and solvent. He submitted reports from the veterinarian confirming herd health and documentation of pasture management. He introduced statements from neighbors who attested to the condition of the land and Hannah's constant presence in the work. Then he called Hannah to testify. She stood, walked to the witness chair, and took a seat. The oath sounded distant, almost unreal. For a moment, she felt the weight of every eye in the room. Then she spoke. She told the judge about her life on the ranch, about decades spent alongside her husband, learning every detail of the operation. She described the months after James's death, the mistakes she made, and the lessons she learned. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, about exhaustion and fear, about waking up each morning unsure if she was strong enough and choosing to continue anyway. When Roy's attorney questioned her, his tone sharpened. He asked how long she believed she could maintain such a pace. He asked what would happen when her health failed. He asked whether turning down a lucrative offer was truly responsible. Hannah met his gaze. She admitted she did not know what the future held. She said she could not promise the ranch would remain hers forever. But she said she was managing it well now, with care and intention, and that she had earned the right to decide its fate. "This land is not just a financial instrument," she said. It's where I live. It's what my husband and I built. I'm not mismanaging it by choosing to stay." The judge listened without interruption. When the testimony ended, he leaned back, reviewing his notes in silence. The pause felt endless. Finally, he spoke. He stated that the evidence showed the ranch was being adequately and responsibly managed. He said that declining a sale, regardless of price, did not constitute mismanagement. He noted the timing of the petition and the limited involvement of the petitioners prior to James's death. His decision was clear. The petition for forced sale was denied. Hannah retained full control of the ranch. The words settled slowly. Relief washed through her in a quiet wave, leaving her weak and steady all at once. Roy stared straight ahead. Michael shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke as the judge dismissed the case. Outside, the air felt lighter. Hannah stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the wind brush against her face. Edward shook her hand and told her she had done well. She thanked him, knowing that no words could fully express her gratitude. Roy and Michael left without a word. Life did not suddenly become easy after that. The work continued, as it always had. Hannah returned to the ranch and kept going. Seasons passed. The land recovered from drought. The herd grew strong again. Over time, the whispers faded, replaced by quiet respect. Years later, when Hannah finally decided to step away, it was on her terms. She sold the ranch to a young couple eager to build a life on the land. She chose them carefully, offered fair terms, and watched as they took their first steps into the same future she once feared. Hannah moved into a small house in town, carrying with her the knowledge that she had not been pushed aside or forced out. She had stayed. She had fought. And she had kept what mattered until she was ready to let it go. The land remained behind her, steady and unchanged, holding the story of a woman who refused to be defined by doubt and proved that determination, grounded in truth, could stand against anything. Some battles are quiet, but they change everything. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and like. Tell us where you're watching from.